A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
The Albanese government's contentious misinformation and disinformation legislation is back in the spotlight. It was shelved last year for lack of bipartisan support, but now the coalition under Peter Dutton appears to have reversed its critical stance, agreeing to work with the government to curb the ability of social media platforms to post harmful material. You'll be familiar with the ongoing controversy now after the alleged terror-related stabbing attack on Bishop Ma Mari Emmanuel last month in Sydney. Tightening regulation around the ability of social media to publish the attack comes even as the bishop at the centre has indicated he wants the video to remain on social media platforms. Let's get some commentary. Augusto Zimmermann has been reflecting on the issue. He's Professor and Head of Law at Sheridan Institute of Higher Education in Perth, and he did serve as Associate Dean at Murdoch University. He's also a former Commissioner with the Law Reform Commission of Western Australia. Augusto Zimmermann, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. It's a real pleasure to talk with you.
Firstly, Augusto, this is an issue of freedom of speech, isn't it? But as Christians, sometimes when we want to get our bearings here, we recognise that there must be some limits on the sort of content that makes up freedom of speech. How do you see things?
Well, look, that's true. We need to have some limits, but the point is that who is going to be providing the limits? I think this is one of the main questions that we should make. And as a matter of fact, we know that inappropriate content can actually be released by the public authorities themselves. Let's not forget, for instance, that the government's information about the vaccines were as government claimed to be safe and effective, in my opinion, constitutes harm and misinformation. So it's a very difficult thing to actually believe that the government will necessarily provide this control that we need. And so I am pretty suspicious of the fact that they want to exercise such a role, and in doing so, limiting information that could potentially contradict the narrative of the ruling classes.
No doubt we can all think of all sorts of violent things that you can see not only on social media but on mainstream free-to-air media almost everywhere. The question, I'll just get your thoughts here, Augusto, the extent to which as adults we should be able to evaluate things ourselves as to what sort of images or videos gets posted and to be able to make that evaluation personally.
Yeah, that's the main point. And you know that the bishop wants to have this information released about the incident that happened or occurred at his church. And as you say, even the official media outlet, ABC, publishes things that are sometimes very questionable from a moral and ethical perspective. But what they are trying to do is pretty simple. It's actually to cancel or restrict any sort of information that can be potentially contradicting the narrative of the establishment. And so I don't think it's a good idea to render this important right of the individual in a democracy to unelected bureaucrats who are going to decide what we should watch and what we should read. That is to treat us as children of a nanny state. And that's the recipe for disaster, I must say.
Interesting when we use that terminology, children. Of course, I imagine that as a Christian and you're thinking through the ethics, the protection of children is paramount. But the protection for adults, not quite so paramount, because it can soon overreach and then fall into this idea of manipulation rather than letting people decide themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. For instance, as you know, the former coalition government, the Morrison regime, under the domestic terrorism response protocols, sought to censor any sort of COVID-related content that in practice amounted to the silencing of anyone, any voice who dared to question lockdowns, mandates, and all these sort of things that were introduced in Australia to completely undermine basic rights and freedoms. So we should have learned a lesson after having to experience 40 years of absolute tyranny, that the government is a very dangerous thing to give so much power. You know that governments have been the primary killing machine in the 20th century. More than 150 million people were killed by governments. So if you actually trust the government to do such a thing, it's better to think about what they did over the last 4 years, treating those who had concerns about certain policies as treating them as if they were terrorists. I think it's not a good time to be trusting government so much. We are asking for trouble if you do so.
So we've got this battle that's been going on between the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner and Elon Musk, who owns X, formerly Twitter. And he agreed to take down the violent content, the stabbing video, but in the sense of hiding it for Australians. But he's refused to do that globally. There is an issue here, isn't there, about how much Australia can dictate what global social media platforms will do.
Yes, that's because this American person, Julie Grant, who happens to be our ESAFE commissioner, she wants to play the role of a global dictator and thinks that she can go on cancelling information that are not just to be provided to the Australian people, but she wants to extend this to a global demand of the censoring of content or information that's considered to be by the Albanese government, which is not particularly known for having an appreciation for fundamental rights, to have this government doing the best to censor the free flowing of information. So another thing you have to bear in mind is that this person has attended the World Economic Forum in 2023, and she had very strange things to say about the need to free speech. Actually, she spoke against freedom of speech and against freedom of expression online.
So there's some caution there around some of the history of the E-Safety Commissioner, but you've been looking at what other nations do around free speech, particularly the US. What sort of speech should be prohibited if you were being guided by any of the American guidelines?
Well, look, of course, that pornography and incitement of violence and all these things have always been not protected by law. And that's because no right can be absolute. There are some limitations, obvious limitations. But what these people are trying to say is that some contents that have a political nature, because they are part of a political communication process, that these things should be censored. And you know that the Constitution of Australia protects us because there is something that the High Court has acknowledged in the past called the implied freedom of political communication. What the government's is basically trying to do now is to be engaged in an international discussion so that they can actually try to legitimize or to give a little bit of a modicum of constitutionality to these oppressive proposals by, as I say, engaging in international conversations so as to trigger the external affairs power. And that will actually be the head of power to be used in order to cancel free speech, not only in Australia, because now I would say being the vanguard of the suppression of free speech, Australia will be leading a trend towards global tyranny.
The cautionary thing here is not that there might be some concerns around a violent video, which we all might be concerned about, but you're concerned about where that leads and what's brought the Misinformation, Disinformation Bill back into focus around an issue that can have some public support may actually lead to this thought that there could be manipulation of that, of what sort of information would be allowed.
Exactly. Another thing you have to consider is that they are now in the process of once again demonizing men in Australia, saying that this is because men here are too aggressive or whatever. So they are going to start the very feminist approach to violence. And another thing that they are doing that can be quite dangerous is this idea that we should not get this information about the background behind what took place at that church a couple of weeks ago. We know that we have basically now opened our borders again and allowing certain characters to migrate that perhaps they will not be able to be completely integrated in the body of our society. So obviously that this is an incident that has been motivated for many other reasons that the government is now trying to suppress the information about them.
Well, we've been talking for years now, Augusto, and around concerns that various pieces of legislation that have come to bear in Australia are a trend towards authoritarianism, and this being another one of those that you're seeing would be another step, and so ought to be treated cautiously, particularly by Christians who might be thinking that freedom of speech is one of those key platforms that we want to maintain.
Yeah, that's right. And, in many ways, what the government does is always excuse themselves of what they have been responsible for. So rather than actually thinking about revisiting our migration policies and making sure that we keep our Christian heritage so that people can behave in a better fashion, what the government does is to actually say that and further demonize and divide people into different categories. And what they are doing, taking advantage of what this happened, this great tragedy, is to try to disarm the population here in Western Australia by enhancing gun control legislation and also to start a new domestic violence policy that actually treats this as a very one-sided matter and, of course, based on a radical feminist narrative. So they're always trying to actually further advance their agenda by capitalizing on the concerns that the community have for very obvious reasons on issues that are of relevance for us.
So there might be all sorts of issues. Whatever comes to mind, you might recognise there are two sides, perhaps two sides and maybe more for every issue, and this sort of legislation may well cause those inabilities to be able to hear the other side of the debate. Well, Augusto Zimmermann is the head of law at Sheridan Institute of Higher Education in Perth. You can read the article. We've been talking about an article that's been published in The Spectator, and you'll be able to find it at spectator.com.au. It's entitled Australia's Global Advocacy for the Suppression of Free Speech, spectator.com.au. Augusto, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today on 2020.
Thank you so much, Neil. God bless you and God bless your listeners.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.